To overanalyze certain games may lead you to miss out on their true worth. As the maxim dictates, the whole can be much greater than the sum of its parts. And in some instances, fixating on a flaw that you found in a game can allow for you to miss out on why it's so special for others. For example, I could clearly define and list all the fragmented and monotonous components of Lawn Mowing Simulator, but to do so would be a waste of time, because at a certain point I would hit a wall due to me just clearly not understanding why this game may be so fun for others. Its perceivably dull gameplay mixed with its graphics and price point are individually all enough to make me snap. But these are just not factors which our virtual groundskeepers care about. What I may interpret to be boring, others know to be soothing or even competitive. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to this, and broken mechanics along with bad writing can compromise a product for just about anybody. I outright refuse to believe that anybody wants their MLB Dream Team to be composed of Sasquatch. But these more undercooked elements are a byproduct of a game being rushed out the door, and are absolutely not deliberate on the developer's end. To expand on my original point, I would like to say that you could virtually state the same thing about any universally beloved game, and not just a lawn mowing simulator. For every Zelda fan, there is also that one person who thinks Breath of the Wild is boring. And while I don't think that this is the case, I could also argue that it's quite fair for somebody to say this. The freedom of choice and serenity of this game hits that perfect note for me, but others may not be able to see the fun behind this game's more open mission design, along with its weapon durability system keeping the player constantly scavenging for new gear. Now, this whole introduction has been to clearly establish the fact that somebody could easily break down every single component of a game and find that one thing that ultimately ruins the experience for them. And under this lens, I feel that our ability to overlook a game's flaws is what enables us to love them. And with this in mind, I can now elaborate a bit more on the feelings I have for an indie classic I wanted to discuss today. Hyper Light Drifter is a somewhat difficult video game to critique. As I stated in the introduction to this video, I could attempt to break down every single component of this title, from the narrative to the user experience, but I don't necessarily think that this is a fair way to evaluate this game. These components are important, and I do still have a lot to say about them, but I don't want to jeopardize an accurate portrayal of my feelings for this game through overemphasizing its flaws. Expanding on this, I would also like to state that while I do believe there are more objective determinants of a game's quality, the most important indicator of quality to me has always been the more subjective and unquantifiable components of a title. While I do appreciate video games that stimulate me through engaging gameplay mechanics or well-written and complex narratives, a game with a strong identity and enthralling world will more often than not prove to be a much more interesting title to me. The uniqueness of a game can determine how long I end up thinking about it, and while gameplay mechanics do contribute to this, I find that the best games are ones which innovate and excel on several fronts, including those which can't really be easily measured. The original Zelda is an obvious point of influence for Hyper Light Drifter, and like Zelda, this game's sense of world and identity is absolutely the main selling point of it. I feel that with this clearly stated, I can now start to depict how Hyper Light Drifter is a great and extremely unique game, and even though there are several other titles which share many of the same mechanical or stylistic components with it, this game has something that a lot of those titles don't, and you could even go as far as to call it this game's X Factor. But before I dissect this characteristic of Hyper Light Drifter, I would like to give a quick description of my history with this title. My initial exposure to this game was observing several people online rave about it, and while seeing people shower it with praise did motivate me to learn more about Hyper Light Drifter, I also feel that it may have slightly altered my experience with it. My expectations on what this game should have been were exceedingly high, and this only compounded with the more praise I heard. This is not a new game, and many more indie titles have released since this one, which have also met a similar high bar of quality. Now, at the time of this game's release, it did feel to me that people were declaring this title as the definitive indie experience. It supposedly had the best soundtrack, the best game design, the best art design, the best combat, while also having the deepest subliminal messaging. In a strange way, I was almost being set up for disappointment. And while I obviously wouldn't be here praising this title like the many others who have in the past if I was dissatisfied with it, I can absolutely admit that Hyper Light Drifter was very close to being lost on me. Luckily though, it wasn't, and I'm disclosing all this information now to mitigate the risk of creating that same pitfall which I almost fell into. This game isn't perfect, no, but it's still exceptional. Now, immediately after I heard the rounds of praise for this title from various outlets, some of which even being my family members or friends, I knew that I wanted to play this game at some point. So, I threw it on my wish list and waited for the right opportunity to play this game. But in the meantime, I decided to experience just one of the several components that so many people have raved about from this title. Oddly enough, this was my first real experience with Hyper Light Drifter, as several years before I actually got the opportunity to play this game, I took time to listen to its soundtrack in full, and might I add that this has to be one of the best collections of songs ever made for a video game, period. There is absolutely no question in my mind that this game's soundtrack rivals that of the original Zeldas, or even that of the original Halo trilogy. It's crushing, but so beautiful and serene at the same time. The synths and pianos add up to a soundtrack which is reminiscent of a 16-bit games, but seemingly done with much more emotional potency. This game was clearly intended to convey a poignant emotional message, and every single song does justice to this game's artistic intent. In fact, this soundtrack is even so good that it holds up outside of the context of this game, and this more ambient album creates an atmosphere which is lush and emotionally oppressive, even when separated from the main experience. But this isn't all that contributes to Hyper Light Drifter's intense atmosphere and strong identity, as when I create a mental picture of this game in my head, I think of two things: its soundtrack, as well as its visual style. Where the music can be spacious, calm, or even sad, this game's art design paints a picture of openness, along with decay and cataclysm. It's a slight contrast that works perfectly, and hearing the beautiful piano ballads while you observe the remnants of Titan's decay right in front of you is an experience which is truly surreal. This game is extremely melancholic, but also vibrant and colorful. It almost has to be experienced just to understand the gravity of this contrast, but this game paints such a strong picture of calmness within its apocalyptic setting, and it's really odd for this. This oddness also happens to give this game much more character, making every single moment hit significantly harder than other games with similar elements. There is an air of mystery surrounding this title's setting, and it allows for it to almost feel mystical in nature. This game has an extremely unique identity, and this element is what primarily comprises that X factor which I discussed earlier. Every single stylistic decision culminated in a title which is uncompromising in its aesthetic and ethos, and this makes Hyper Light Drifter feel much larger in scale than it actually is. The whole remains much greater than the sum of its parts. As of right now, my assessment of this game has been glowing, and while I do believe that this game deserves its flowers, I still feel an obligation to taper expectations to a certain extent, as I must remind you, this game isn't perfect. I just stated that the whole is great, but what about those parts? Let me start by stating that I love the combat in this game. There is a certain freedom of choice when the player chooses how to approach each combat encounter, and nothing is spoon-fed to the player, which I definitely appreciate. Whether or not the player decides to lean more into the melee combat, gun mechanics, or bombs to apply damage to the enemies is completely up to them, and this allows for us to critically assess the best way to approach each situation. The enemy types are excellent, and the bosses were just difficult enough to force the player to adapt to this game's more unique mechanics, but never too hard to the point where you would get frustrated with their design. Also, might I add that the movement is phenomenal in this game. The dash mechanic was something I actually had to practice in order to be effective at using during combat, and it was really gratifying to evade attacks with it. The competency in this game's movement mechanics also makes the game very fun to navigate through, and in general, every player action feels weighty and pretty well balanced. With this in mind, I now have to state that it's unfortunate the world and objective mechanics couldn't live up to the same level of quality. This game's primary objective consists of actively searching for these terminals which open up each region's boss fight, and while this isn't necessarily bad in concept, these terminals don't always feel extremely well placed, or even that fun to search for. This game has many secrets, and a lot of them are quite satisfying to find. However, I don't necessarily think that a reward for pursuing these hidden areas should have ever been an extra terminal. Not only does it feel unfair when you can't find one, but it also feels extremely unrewarding to stumble on them accidentally. There were a few instances during my initial playthrough where I would be moving throughout the world casually and see a terminal just sitting there. Like, how am I as the player supposed to feel about this? These are mandatory objectives regardless of how many you need to beat the game, and every single terminal I found in the first zone felt so meticulously well placed and rewarding to find. Later in the game though, when I happened to find one just sitting there, it somewhat undermined the satisfaction I felt when I was initially finding the terminals from the first region. It's not like the hidden ones are placed in ideal locations either, as in the third region I went to, there were several terminals which happened to be stacked near the area's entrance. The entire region, which should have taken me an hour or two to beat, only took me 30 minutes due to the haphazard placement of these objectives. On a more positive note, I found all of the regions to be distinct and well designed, and while I do believe that some are better than others, I still found all of them to be fun in their own way. This somewhat wraps up the feelings I have for the gameplay and mechanics within this game, but unfortunately I still have one more grievance with this title. The administration of this game's narrative somewhat confuses me. The subliminal messages that this game throws out there are incredibly profound, especially when considering the developer's history with congenital heart disease. But I found that the actual implementation of the narrative within this game wasn't always great. Like, what is the point of having dozens of NPCs you can talk to if very few of them say anything of value? Along with this, the images that are used to represent an NPC's experiences are cool, but I always felt that there were never enough of them to paint a cohesive story. I find it hard to relate to any of the characters within this game when I'm given a total of 3 possibly related pictures pertaining to each one's background. I respect the unique approach to dialogue that the developers took, and I'm sure that some people enjoy this more esoteric approach, but it almost feels like they didn't have enough resources to make it actually work. I also wouldn't be able to end this video in good conscience if I didn't bring this up, but the sequencing in this game is extremely linear and kind of predictable. You go from zone to zone and then fight the final boss with very few detours in between, and I do think that this game would have been better off if they shook up the formula a little bit more. I won't get more specific than this though, as I don't want to spoil anything, but I couldn't end this video without talking about it briefly. These are all of my issues with the game, and while none of them were enough to be the final straw to break the camel's back for me, I could see them negatively impacting someone else's perception of this experience. Hyper Light Drifter has a thick atmosphere and strong identity, but certain components of it leave room for improvement. This is where I stand on this game, and anybody who believes they value what it does well should absolutely give it a shot at some point. Or at least listen to the soundtrack. I just completed my university degree, and with this, my time as a student is officially over. At least for now. During this last exam period of mine, I found that I had very little time to do the things I love, and playing new games along with writing these videos fell to the wayside for a little while. However, this doesn't mean that I didn't have time to think about video games, as during my downtime I found myself reminiscing over some of the titles which have meant a lot to me in the past. Hyper Light Drifter just happened to be one of these games. This is why the moment-to-moment gameplay is not something I'm necessarily concerned about when evaluating games such as this, and I feel that this title specifically is much better characterized by the long-lasting impact it leaves on the player through its unique identity. Before I committed to writing this video though, I had to figure out what this game's impact has been on me, and more importantly, what things I had to say about it. I figured out over time that the artistic and unquantifiable elements of this game were too significant for me to not discuss. And with this, I would like to say that I think most people should try this game if anything in this video looked appealing to them. I know that Hyper Light Breaker is on the horizon, and while I am excited for it, I am also trying to taper my expectations. I know that this game won't have the exact same impact on me as its predecessor, and my excitement for the first game almost made it difficult to accurately assess. But quite like the first one, I will still play it at some point, along with the rest of Heart Machine's games. I hope that I was able to do this game justice in a way that is accurate to my experience, and I hope that you all enjoyed hearing about my time with this title. With this being said, I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you for watching.